Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the next in a series of webinars sponsored by the National Humanities Center. Tonight's session is titled Cultivating Students' Philosophical Thinking. We're being joined by Jana Mohr of the Center for Philosophy for Children at the University of Washington. We're very pleased that you can join us tonight. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm joining you tonight actually from a hotel room in Washington, D.C. I'm here to do some work with the National Endowment for the Humanities. But this, to me, just illustrates again why these webinar platforms are so powerful in terms of having conversations around content and scholarship and teaching and learning. And it's wonderful to have all of you joining us from across the country. As a matter of fact, as I see your names and your introductions in the chat box, I noticed we've got some folks internationally, including someone from Turkey tonight. So again, it's, I think, worth underlining how special it is to be able to bring all of you together in this one spot to have a conversation around this very compelling topic. I'm joined, by the way, by Libby Taylor, my colleague in Raleigh, North Carolina, who is behind the scenes manning our platform and our webinar. Libby works closely with our scholars to collect and create the PowerPoints that will be associated with tonight's session. She also works with you to make sure that you get the appropriate certification and you get all the notifications that you need. If you have any problems at all with the webinar or with the complementary materials that we have available, please reach out, make sure that you email myself or Libby, and we'll get back to you as fast as we can. And we very much want to make sure that this is a seamless process for all of you. Tonight's webinar will work as an audio-only format, meaning you will hear myself and Jana's talk. You'll hear Jana as she walks through her PowerPoint and shares with you her background and her expertise. But you will be able to interact with us primarily through text. And so if you take a look at the chat box in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the spot where you can register thoughts, you can ask questions, you can queue up things that resonate for you, you can converse with each other. That includes, by the way, a private chat function. Simply find the name that you'd like to chat to in the scroll-down menu, and you can immediately and privately talk with others who are in the webinar tonight. I'm going to make sure that your mic is muted so we don't have any background noise, but as you enter or come back and forth, please make sure that you do the same. National Humanities Center is, in many ways, I think, a bridge between the scholarly world and the teaching world. We have access to and work with scholars from across the country who are specialists and who are experts in a variety of humanities fields. And for me, really, the backbone of all of our work in education starts with that content. You know, there used to be an old commercial, I think it was NBC used to run the commercial, "The more you know." And in fact, I think that's very much true for teaching. The more you know, the more capable you feel and confident you are in navigating complex topics in your classroom, the better prepared you are, the easier it is to navigate and to share these kinds of materials with your students. And so all of our materials, including these webinars, really focus on giving you an opportunity to talk directly with and learn directly from experts in particular fields. For me, that is what leads to the transformation of our profession. It ideally is a very professional environment in which you feel as your colleagues, both with other teachers in the room as well as with the scholars who lead our sessions. And please note that the other participants in these webinars may also be outside of the classroom. They might be other scholars, university personnel, they might be curriculum leaders. Really consider this a conversational lab to think through and to think about the different topics that we have available. And then ultimately, I think that leads to advocacy for the humanities. Sometimes when things are of threat, it reminds us of the value, and certainly the humanities has been in the crosshairs for the last 18 months or so. I think one of the goals, primary goals of the National Humanities Center is to make sure that we can articulate and show value in the humanities, not as extra luxurious things that we may or may not study, but essential parts of the curriculum, essential parts of the skills and the tools that we have as a developing citizenry. In the education field, we do this in a variety of ways. I would encourage all of you to go to our online bank of lessons and resources. americanclass.org/lessons will give you access to free and accessible lessons on a variety of topics. The webinar series, the first of which you might be participating in tonight, is also a chance to not just work with a scholar, but get the materials that they pull together in support of the topics. We've tried to make this year's webinar series very topical and very relevant. We've tried to focus on issues that that you'll be discussing and working in your classrooms around, even if it's not part of your curriculum. And I would encourage you to go in and register for as many as you think you might have time for and be interested in. I will say that this year our webinar series can sell out, meaning there will be a limit on the number of slots that we can make available in a session because of the platform that we use. And so while I don't want you to go in and just sign up to have your name in there and take a slot you might not use, I would encourage you to go through the entire series all the way till May. And the ones that really speak to you, go ahead and sign up and get your name in the hat. I know we have at least one, maybe two that's sold out so far. We try to maintain a relevancy, a connection to the classroom through a teacher advisory council. As you can see, we have teachers from literally all over the country who work with us, who contribute to our work, who promote the National Humanities Center and the work that we do. That includes previous teacher advisory council members like Patricia Marshall, who in Illinois tonight has assembled many of her teacher cohorts, teachers from her school who are together collectively watching tonight's webinar. And I would encourage any of you to do the same. If you've got a department or a school that you like to organize an event around and participate in these webinars together, that would be fantastic. I would encourage you to have each person sign in individually though, so they can get a certificate of completion. It may be too, by the way, that some of our webinars are appropriate for your students. And so whether you assign them sort of an extra credit or part of your curriculum you assign to them to attend a webinar, or you take advantage of our recorded webinars to show afterwards, that might be an interesting way to, again, connect the scholarship and the teaching that we both work in. When tonight's session is over, you'll receive a link for a survey. Upon completion of that survey, you'll receive a certificate of completion. And sometimes the system gets a little bit slow. I would give it about an hour for you to receive this email. Certainly give it till the next morning if you like, but if you don't receive it for some reason and you've checked your spam box and can't find it, please be sure that you email Libby or myself and we'll make sure that we get one to you. We also have a vibrant social network, all of us do, personal and professional network behind us. Please take some time to share the work that we do, anything that resonates in tonight's webinar with your own network. We've got some Twitter handles that are set up and some hashtags that we can use, but this is certainly one way that you can keep not only posted on the work that we do at the center, but you can help us connect with other educators who may be interested. For tonight's session, it's funny, it's a good segue. Just today, I sent a tweet out to promote tonight's session and to try to get a few more slots filled before we launched. And the tweet that I sent asked and reiterated 3 of the primary questions that we provided as a description of tonight's session. And those questions are we free? What is a mind? And how do we define happiness? Those are pretty important questions that human beings be able to answer. I think something that the National Humanities Center believes strongly in is that the humanities become tools to help us understand who we are and understand the connection with the community around us, at whatever size that community might be. Those are the kinds of questions that I would want my own children and the students that I teach to be able to answer, to be able to have the vocabulary around seeking those answers. And so it's with great pleasure that I welcome Jana Mohr alone to join us tonight, and maybe not answer that question for you specifically, but certainly to give you and your students the resources and the experiences and the background vocabulary to begin to answer them yourself. Jana, you're in Seattle. I'm in Washington. Can you hear me? Hello.
I can.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to let you introduce yourself. Your resume and your CV is impressive, but I'm anxious also to get the answer to these burning questions. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm not sure I'm going to provide the answers to those questions, but I will.
That's what everybody signed up for.
But I am going to try to help us
Good.
at least
Thank you.
think about some of these kinds of questions. So I'm Jana Mohr. I run a center at the University of Washington that brings philosophy into the lives of young people. We've been doing this work for over 20 years. And one of the things that I always find whenever I walk into a classroom of whether it be first grade students or high school students is that most young students are really interested in thinking about and talking with other students about philosophical questions. Let me turn to the next slide here.
And Jenna, if that doesn't work, let me know. I've given you control of the mouse, and it should
Yep.
work, but if it doesn't, I will advance it for you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it for you.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Okay, so I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about what philosophy is, because I know that many teachers don't have a background in philosophy and maybe haven't taken any philosophy classes. So philosophy the word itself comes from the Greek. Philos means love, and Sophia, wisdom. And so the word's often translated as love of wisdom. So of course that raises what we might consider a philosophical question, which is, what is wisdom? And for philosophy, wisdom, or at least the attempt to find wisdom, comes from questions. The kinds of questions that explore most of the basic parts of the human condition, like what is love? What is friendship? What does it mean to care for another person? How do we know things about the world? What makes something beautiful? Etc. And philosophers often look at questions that are at the sort of most basic level that we can get to. So, for example, someone might say, oh, that's not fair, and a philosopher will say, what is fairness? What is it that makes something fair? Is there a problem with is everyone able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Oh, okay. And when a student might talk about whether they don't think someone's a very good friend, that's an opportunity to say, well, what is friendship? What makes someone a friend? Does being a friend mean that you always treat people with a certain level of care, or do friends sometimes act in ways that we might not think are most desirable, etc.? So really at the heart of philosophy is questions. Rabbi Heschel once suggested that philosophy can actually be defined as the art of asking the right questions. And I think that one of the reasons that it's really important to bring philosophy into young people's lives, and I say that actually that's kind of, let me say it a little bit differently, because I think children are already, and young people are already thinking about philosophical questions, but what we can do is engage them in inquiry, help provide a space for them to think together about these kinds of questions. And I think it's particularly important in schools because philosophy is so centered around questioning. And although we all know that asking good questions is one of the most important skills you can have in navigating through life, in fact, in most schools, student questions are not at the heart of what's going on in the classroom most of the time. And taking student questions seriously requires a kind of a shift in the way that we run a classroom that I think is often new to many schools. Okay, so I said a little bit already about why introduce philosophy in schools. I talked about questioning, about the fact that many young people and children ask questions like, what is time? Are numbers real? Can you be happy and sad at the same time? All the time, but there's no real forum for talking about such questions. And in fact, I think many times children are, we assume that children really can't think seriously about such questions. So when they ask them, we tend to often, I think, unfortunately, look at what they say as being really cute or adorable and not really engage them in thinking about the questions that they put forth. And So and I think that's especially true in the United States because it's one of the few countries in the world where philosophy isn't regularly taught in high school. So philosophy is seen by many people as something that's done in the academy by people with advanced degrees, and that really has very little relevance to our daily lives. And one of the cornerstones of my own work is really breaking that open, because I think philosophy belongs to all of us, and that we all engage in philosophical thinking just as part of being a human being. Whenever we ask ourselves, what's the right thing to do here? Or does my life have meaning? Or how can I be sure I really know this? We're engaging in philosophical thinking. And so I think that helping students to see that that is something they are both capable of, and it's a valuable way for them to spend their time, is really important. I list here some of what I think of as philosophical dispositions, some of the things that I think young people take away from being introduced to philosophy, which include things like learning to evaluate underlying assumptions, to communicate their own views, and often also to develop confidence in stating their views and asking questions without being afraid that the question they're asking, is not important or shows that they're not smart enough or whatever. Philosophy, because it doesn't engage questions that have settled answers. You can't look up on Google the answer to the question, what is happiness? I mean, I guess you can, but you're probably not going to find a final settled answer, right? So because of that, it gives students a real space to think independently and to explore all kinds of ways of thinking without feeling like there's one right answer that they're supposed to get and communicate. And so because of that, I'm sorry.
Jen, I was going to ask you just a quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure, no problem.
I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, but to your knowledge, was philosophy ever routinely taught in the American school? And if so, when did that end?
To my knowledge, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's taught regularly in some private schools and parochial schools, right, but it has, to my knowledge, never been taught regularly in public schools.
And is there something unique about the American education system that would make that different than others?
Well, we could probably have a whole nother webinar on that question, but I think there is in the American school system a tendency to be less interested in the history of ideas or in intellectual analysis, and much more, at least the history of our public schools, is to be focused on practical skills, the kinds of skills you'll need in the workplace. So I think that's part of the reason, but again, I think there's a long, complicated history around this that would take a lot more time to thoroughly analyze. And then finally, I just want to say one of the things I really get excited about when I'm in classrooms of young people, especially classrooms when there's a wide diversity of students, is that students really learn that there are many ways to see the world. So I will hear, and one of the things I love about working with young people is they're so unafraid to change their minds and to communicate that they're changing their minds. And I will hear students say all the time, I hadn't thought about that way until you said that. And they also come to see that I, for example, might have a view of friendship that involves, spending time with someone, being there when they need me, etc. And someone else might have a very different view of friendship. But that doesn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong, right? We can come at friendship and at many other philosophical questions from many different points of view. And I guess one more thing while I'm waiting for this slide to change. One of the things that I think is really important about philosophy is that it keeps at the center of the discipline the joy of wondering about the world. And children tend to do a lot of wondering, but I think as adults, as we get to sort of early adulthood, we start to come to think that wondering isn't really a very valuable way to spend your time. And I personally think that wondering about the world is part of being a human being. It keeps the world alive, and helping students to see that adults wonder and that continuing to wonder is an important thing to do, I think is a very valuable enterprise. Okay, so I'm going to move us a little bit into now that I've talked about why do philosophy, how do you do philosophy with young people? And of course, there's a lot of different ways to do this. And at the end of this presentation, there'll be some online resources for you to look at. And it will be quite different, perhaps, what you do with, for example, a group of kindergarten students or first graders than what you might do in a philosophy class of high school seniors. But I think that one of the most powerful practices for engaging all ages, including, you know, undergraduates and adults in philosophical inquiry, is what we call a community of philosophical inquiry. And what that really means is that the community itself determines what philosophical issues are being examined, looks at the enterprise in which they're engaged as part of constructing meaning in a collaborative way, and really seeks to gain greater understanding about the world, acknowledging that in all likelihood, there's not going to be final answers to the questions being explored. So there's acceptance of what philosophers sometimes call epistemological modesty, and that just means that epistemology is how do we know things about the world, and so epistemological modesty is just an awareness that all of us, including the facilitator, the teacher, the professor, are fallible. We all don't have perfect knowledge and never will, and therefore we hold views, even however strongly, that could end up being mistaken. We might not think they're likely to be mistaken, but we acknowledge that it's possible that we will change our minds, given, you know, strong enough evidence and strong enough reasons. Okay, I think I need help switching this. Thank you. So connected to that, as the teacher, one of the things you want to do is demonstrate a kind of a reticence about advocating your own philosophical views, because I've found that often, you know, the students that I teach call me Dr. Jana, and so they'll say, well, Dr. Jana, what do you think? And I know that if I tell them what I think about a particular philosophical topic, they will decide that that's actually the answer. And of course, that's not at all. First of all, it's not, and second of all, that's not what I want them to take away. So I model a comfort with uncertainty, with, well, you know, you might think about it this way or you might think about it that way, but recognizing that there isn't a final answer that I'm going to kind of give to them as a way of resolving the issue. I'm not going to go through all of these bullets on this screen, but I did want to say a little something about intellectual safety. So one of the things I think is really important in philosophy classes, particularly because we are examining questions without settled answers, and often questions that are of deep personal interest to the students, that the environment be a safe one. And that means that students are going to listen to each other, they're not going to denigrate each other's points of view, they're going to, if they disagree, be able to give good reasons, they're going to connect to what each other says, they're going to recognize there are many ways to see the world, etc. But there's often, I think, a confusion between creating an intellectually safe environment and creating an environment that's comfortable. Philosophy isn't always comfortable. Philosophy often pushes us to re-examine our views, to recognize that we think something and we really don't actually have a very good reason for why we think it, or that our reasons upon reflection turn out not to be as good as we had thought. So sometimes there's some discomfort in philosophy, right? But that's, I think, part of learning to question your assumptions, learning to examine the world, and in an authentic way. And if there's a safe environment in which to do it, that discomfort can actually lead to transformation and learning. Okay, so here are the questions that, some of the questions that the text we're going to look at tonight, and these are just examples that I pulled out that I have used with students. There's tons of them that, and many of them are on our website and other websites, and again, those resources will be presented at the end of this presentation. Okay, so why do people behave morally? So an ethical question. 2, would we choose to live forever if we could? What is the relationship between death and life? I find that when I ask students, as I often do in the beginning of the year, what do you think are the most important questions in life? Often questions about death appear on the list. And the selection we'll talk about is a really nice way to start to talk about questions about life and death. And then a question of aesthetics or what makes something art, and then another ethical, and maybe you could consider this a social philosophical question: how do I know the right thing to do, and what is fairness? Okay, this is the first selection. This is from Plato's Republic, which was written about 2,500 years ago, and it's called The Ring of Gyges. It's a really nice passage to use in an early philosophy class with all ages. I've used it with kindergarten, I use it with my undergraduates. It's very accessible, and the discussions you have will obviously be on different levels if you're dealing with kindergarten versus high school or students or graduate students or undergraduate students, but it is a story that is immediately interesting to most students, I have found.
Jen, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to read this to give you a chance to kind of rest and catch up with the chat box, and then we're going to get your impressions in just a moment.
Perfect, thanks.
The Ring of Gyges. Why do people behave morally? Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia. One day there was a violent thunderstorm, and an earthquake broke up in the ground and created a crater at the place where Gyges was tending his sheep. Seeing the big hole, Gyges was filled with amazement and went down into it. And there, in addition to many other wonders of which we are not told, he saw a hollow bronze horse. There were window-like openings in it, and peeping in, he saw a corpse, which seemed to be more than human size, wearing nothing but a gold ring on its finger. He took the ring and came out of the crater. Gyges wore the ring at the usual monthly meeting that reported to the king on the state of the flocks of sheep. As he was sitting among the others, he happened to turn the setting of the ring towards himself to the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting near him, and they went on talking as if he had gone. He wondered at this, and fingering the ring, he turned the setting outwards again and became visible. So he experimented with the ring to test whether it indeed has this power, and it did. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. When he realized this, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he quickly became the queen's lover. With her help, he attacked the king, killed him, and took over the kingdom.
So Plato has us imagine two magic rings. One that's given to, someone we would think of as a really good person, say like Mother Teresa, and one to a person who is maybe not so good, like Gyges, perhaps. And in the Republic, Plato's character Glaucon contends that there would actually be no difference in the way the two would behave. People only behave morally, he claims, because they're afraid of the consequences of getting caught if they behave badly. And if you had no chance of getting caught, you would do all kinds of things that we would not think of as morally acceptable. So when I read the story with students, and I do this frequently whatever the prompt is that I'm using, I'll ask them first, what questions does this make you wonder about, and kind of get the questions that are raised by the passage for them. But a nice way to start with this one is, what would you do if you had a ring that made you invisible? So I'll ask that to all of you to maybe use the chat box to answer that, and then tell you a little bit about some of my experiences with this question. Because children, of course, adults are more reticent about answering this question, but children are happy to tell you all the things that they would do if they had a ring that would make them invisible, which often is things like playing pranks on their siblings and hiding on a plane so they could travel, and I actually had one student, this was in a 4th grade class a few years ago, give a very detailed plan for how he would rob a store in his neighborhood. This is like a 9-year-old, and what he would do and what he would take, and I was sort of like, okay, wait a minute, this is a little frightening. But Also, students often say things like, I would I would help my neighbors in a way that I would be kind of worried about doing because I wouldn't want them to know I was helping them, or I would, volunteer to be part of the security at the airport because if I was invisible, I could overhear all kinds of conversations and be be a powerful help to security. So when students say those kinds of things, then you can that can lead into this conversation. Okay, so if you had no chance of getting caught and you had this ring and you could do all kinds of things that we think of as socially problematic and that might end up with terrible consequences. But instead of doing those kinds of things, you were doing things like helping your country or helping your community in ways that would be harder to do without the invisibility power. If that's true, if there are reasons that we do that, if we would do those kinds of good things, then what about this claim that we only behave morally because we're afraid of the consequences of getting caught if we don't? Are there other reasons that we want to be good people? Is being afraid of what would happen if we aren't, or wanting to have everyone's approval if we are, only part of the picture? Are there other aspects to being a human being that lead us to want to behave in certain what we think of as morally good ways, whether or not anyone ever knows about it? And that's a really interesting conversation I have found to have with kids, because students are often in a world where a lot of what they choose to do is constrained by all kinds of consequences, right? And to ask them about the choices they make or might make without that kind of structure of consequence is an opportunity for them to really think about the kind of people that they want to be. Okay, I'm going to move us on here.
Do you want that? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so many of you probably know this story, Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. There's a really nice chapter, chapter 12, and I often read part of that chapter to students to talk about these questions like, would we choose to live forever if we could, and what's the relationship between death and life? And Andy, if you wouldn't mind reading this.
Certainly. Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. And again, the prompts are, what would we choose to live forever if we could, and what is the relationship between life and death? Tuck Everlasting is the story of the Tuck family, a family of 4. Years ago, the family discovered a spring of water which, they realized after they all drank from it, makes you immortal. Winnie Foster, a 10-year-old girl who has stumbled upon the well, has made friends with Jessie Tuck, who appears to be about 17, but who is actually 104 years old, and is then kidnapped by the Tuck family in an effort to explain to her why she must never tell anyone about the spring. In chapter 12, Winnie has a conversation with Tuck, the father of the family, about time, the meaning of life and death, and what it means never to grow old. Winnie is tempted to drink from the spring, but Tuck tries to describe to her what it would mean to be immortal and how living outside of the wheel of life presents its own challenges. Tuck reveals that he would like to grow again and change, and tries to make Winnie understand that dying is an essential part of life, even if the prospect of it is frightening. Dying's part of the wheel, right there next to being born. You can't pick out the pieces you like and leave the rest. Being part of the whole thing, that's the blessing. But it's passing us by, us Tucks. Living's heavy work, and off to the side, the way we are, it's useless too. It don't make sense.
So the first question I'd like you to think about and use the chat to respond to is, if you could drink from the spring of immortality, would you? And why or why not?
We're going to pause there, Jana, and let folks type their answer in. It's interesting, by the way, to consider this question as an adult or later in life than it might be when you're younger. Someone like Judith immediately says, absolutely not, no, in capital letters. Living forever, the translation from body to soul is lost. Jeffrey reminds us, sort of thinking back to the ring of Gages, about the power of invisibility, and that ring being central pieces of two major pieces of fiction. Shelby says, no, never. Death makes us appreciate the shortness of life. Susie in Los Angeles says no. Patricia, of course, is trying to, Pat, who was a member of our advisory council last year, and I know likes to split these kinds of things. I know her kids would ask the same thing. She wants to know, could we reverse that immortality in any way, or is this a permanent condition?
Right, and so I think that the thought experiment, as we say in philosophy, is once you drink from the spring, and certainly that's the truth in the story, there's no going back.
Right.
You've made the choice, so now you are immortal. And I thought it was interesting that someone in here said, I wouldn't want to outlive my loved ones. I read this story with a group of fifth graders last year, and one of the students started off by saying, yes, I would definitely want to live forever. And then as the conversation went on, and some students were saying, well, so if you had a child, then the child would die before you. And then this young girl said, wait a minute, so not only would your child die, but your grandchildren would die before you, and your great-grandchildren, and your great-grand, and she just said, there's no way I would want to do that. It was quite interesting the way, the conversation sort of turned her around from her initial reaction to it.
It's interesting too. Kelly Davis, who I believe is an early career teacher in Los Angeles, mentions reading this book in grade school and it having a profound philosophical impact on her, but I doubt, or at least I'm inferring from her comment, that her teacher did not facilitate that. So as you suggested earlier, kids are thinking about these things. They are struggling and grappling with these issues, perhaps through a book like this, but it is something that we can harness as teachers.
Well, and it makes you think about, what would life be like if we didn't die? Several people have pointed out how the preciousness and beauty of life, that part of that is dependent on it being finite, right? And so if we didn't die, would it be life as we know it, or would it be something completely different than what we now experience as life?
Excellent, thank you. Would you like me to advance it, Jana?
Let's just give it a couple more seconds and see if people want to say a few more things. I want to give them some space to do that. Oh, that's an interesting question that Kelly asks about reincarnation. If you're born into another form, how is that like being immortal or different from being immortal? Which would be a really interesting conversation to have, I think, with students, because of course the idea of being reborn into another form means that you don't have any memory of your current life. So what is that? Is that like being immortal? Is it, in what ways is it different? Would be really interesting. Actually, I got a email yesterday from a parent whose 11-year-old child is really experiencing a lot of anxiety about the prospect of death. And I really related to that because I was that kind of a 10, 11-year-old. And so I suggested this book to the parent and said, you might have these kinds of conversations with him to have him start to think about the role that death plays in life, and whether, in fact, life would be like without death. It's interesting to ask students questions like, why is death frightening? And what would it be like if no one ever died, if everyone was immortal? What would that be like? And then a really nice question to ask students is if you could be one age forever, what age would it be? Because that leads into these often really interesting discussions about if you were always, 25, would being 25 be like being 25 when you know that it only lasts for a year? Okay, Ben. Okay, so we're going to, this is a good question that Vicki just asked, by the way, what exactly is forever? It's a really fascinating philosophical question that, and I like that you've been 23 for 20 years too. I can relate to that. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit into aesthetics, which is often a really accessible topic for kids because they want to think about what makes something art or what makes something beautiful. And it's interesting because in elementary school, if you start with like a group of kindergartners and you ask them how many of them are artists, pretty much the entire class is going to raise their hands. If you ask that in 5th grade, you'll get a fraction, right? Because there's some of them who've already decided they can't do art. And so having these conversations at older ages about what makes something art and what is art really and what makes someone an artist can be very powerful experiences for students. So there's the first 2 slides we're going to look at in this part of the presentation are cases that come from this book, Cases for Kids. There's some really nice ideas for teaching aesthetics in this book. Okay, so the first one is, one day your teacher says she wants to draw a picture of you. You're excited. She takes a sheet of paper and covers the whole surface in purple, and then she tacks it up on the board. Under it, she writes, "This is a picture of Jana." Okay, so would you be upset? Why? Why not? Could that be a good picture of you? What do you think?
We'll pause for a moment and let folks give their answers some time. That's the thing about asking these kinds of questions, Jana, is that it does take a minute to process through.
Well, and one of the things I really try and do, and I know probably many of the teachers who are on this webinar also do, is get comfortable with silence in a classroom. So I'll sometimes ask a question and no one will respond right away, and I'll let it sit, and then I'll let it sit past the part where I'm comfortable with it and a little further. And often there'll be a student who ordinarily wouldn't speak who then has a space to do so. So I find that, and especially in philosophy, because philosophy, these questions often, you need a little time to reflect. So it's interesting. Some people raise these. Several people have said things like, "Well, I like purple, so it'd be okay," or I like red, so purple wouldn't work for me." Or so I wonder about color, right? That could lead into a really interesting conversation with the students about color. Why do certain colors speak to us? Is color actually in the picture itself, or is it in us and the way we see it? Do certain colors make all of us feel certain things, or do different colors make different people feel different things? For example, we talk about blue often as kind of a calming color, but for some people maybe blue isn't a very calming color, etc. And we might talk about the power of color and why certain colors affect us in certain ways, or certain combinations of colors affect us in certain ways. I actually had this conversation several years ago at a high school in Memphis where this question about color came up, and I hadn't realized until the conversation started that this was a school, because of gang issues, in which the students weren't allowed to wear color. They had to only wear black and white. And this led into this really powerful conversation about how much they missed color and how color made them feel alive, and the way in which the absence of color in their school took some of the life and vibrancy out of the experience of being a student there. It's really quite powerful. And yes, I agree with what Vicki just said. It does exactly give kids space to think about what does it mean to present your image or experience of something or someone. It doesn't have to be, right, a particular way, a realist drawing or whatever. You could just see someone as blue and paint the paper blue or whatever. Or use shapes or, you know. So I'm interested what that means, what Jennifer just said, how it makes us feel when the gray is missing. Can you say more about that? What is that? What do you mean exactly? And Jeffrey's question is a really good question and can lead into this whole question about who's entitled to be a critic, and is everything art? If sometimes I'll take a piece of paper in the classroom and I'll just crumble it up and throw it on the ground and say, okay, that's my art. Is that art? And some students will say something like, well, if you think it's art, it's art. And I'll say, well, so no matter what, if I think it's art, no matter what anyone else says it's art, well, it's art, but it might not be very good art, they might say. So then, right, so then there's the question of like, okay, A, what makes something art, and B, how do we judge art, right? Are there standards that we can use to determine whether a piece of art is actually of a certain quality or not, and who decides that, and how does that get decided, and how do then, given those standards, how do they change, right? Because one time certain art would not be considered very good, and then 10, 15, 20 years later, all of a sudden, the art is understood in a different way, right? That's interesting. Pink is supposed to be calming, huh? And I wonder if it brings out negative feelings and aggression, because after a while, any one color like that would just, get to you, especially in a cell. And especially a color as distinctive as pink. That's interesting. Okay, so gray tones, this is what you were talking about, that there's black and white, and then there's black and white where there's some shading and some kind of more diversity in what you're looking at. Yes, I highly recommend Tolstoy's essay, What is Art? It's kind of a classic in aesthetics and very accessible and really helpful in thinking about some of these questions if you're interested in them. Okay, I'm going to move us on here. So this is the second case from the same book. So this is based on a work by Carl Andre that was purchased by the Tate Gallery in London in 1976. Many of you probably know this story. A person well known as a minimalist sculptor buys 120 bricks, and on the floor of a well-known art museum, he arranges them in a rectangular pile, 2 bricks high, 6 across, and 10 lengthwise. He labels the work, Pile of Bricks. Across town, a bricklayer's assistant at a building site takes 120 bricks of the very same kind and arranges them in the very same way. Wholly unaware of what's going on in the museum, he's just a very organized, tidy bricklayer's assistant. So, is the first piece a work of art? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And if the first piece is a work of art, what about the second one? Can that be a work of art too? I like the story about Judith's son who wadded up pieces of paper on the floor with an overturned trash can. Yeah, I mean, dorm boys, that's great. Right, I mean, exactly. I mean, occasionally I'll take a blank piece of paper and ask the students if that can be art. And many times they'll say, no, you didn't do anything. And I'll say, okay, what if I call it silence? Is that art then? And which raises some interesting questions. So it's about intent, Mary says. So meaning that if you intend it to be a work of art, it is, or that you have to have intent and maybe other things in order for it to be a work of art. Right, and how do you know what the intent is? I mean, in the bricklayer example, it's fairly clear that the bricklayer didn't have intent, right? The bricklayer just was laying the bricks to be organized and neat, but it turned out that it looked exactly the same as the Tate Museum exhibit, in which the artist did have intent. So both are works of art, meaning both the bricklayers and the artists. Huh, interesting. I wonder though, is everything in life a work of art? I mean, if I don't know, if I'm cleaning up my yard and I'm just strewing things all over, making a big pile that I'm going to then take out to the compost, and I look at it and I think, wow, that's a mess, I got to put it away. And someone else says, well, could that be a work of art? I don't know that I would think it. I mean, I guess it could be, but is it?
Jana, does that change in the medium of art?
Well, right. That's a good question. I mean, we're thinking primarily in terms of visual art.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you think about like John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right, where it tested this whole, which is, by the way, there's a nice on our website, there's a nice lesson plan for using that. And in case you don't know it, it's basically 4 minutes and 33 seconds of total silence done in different movements that are choreographed. And it really pushes this question, which Cage meant to push: what makes something music? He saw it as a listening experience, right? So when you're thinking you're going to hear someone playing piano, but you don't, all you hear is the closing and opening of the lid occasionally and no other sounds, you start to hear sounds in the world, right, that you wouldn't otherwise be listening to. And so he was pushing this idea, similar to what some of the people here have said, that just like everything might be art, every sound might be music. Art is in the eye of the beholder, which connects to this earlier question, right, about how we judge art. I mean, if art's in the eye of the beholder, are some beholders more qualified than others to judge art? So, for example, if I'm a curator in a museum and I look at a painting, am I in a better position to determine whether it's of a certain quality than, someone who never looks at art and doesn't care about art and just happens to walk by and look at it is, or not? So this is an interesting comment that Phaedra made. So people can be works of art. But if everything is art, this is Jeffrey's point, it seems art becomes meaningless to a degree. Right, because it seems like there's a big difference between my crumbled up piece of paper and the Mona Lisa, right? Well, that's the question though, right? I mean, is the curator, yes, clearly the curator is more qualified to determine what should be in his or her museum. But if the curator says, look, this is a really cool idea you did with the crumbled piece of paper, but it's not the Mona Lisa, is the curator wrong about that? And so just as a sort of a meta description of what I'm doing here, this is the kind of thing that is really important to do in philosophy sessions, to just, once students make certain comments and observations and put forth certain views, to kind of think about other ways of seeing it and say, well, that's interesting, but what about this? To help them to think about all of the possible ways to look at particular questions. Yeah, so if modern art is about ideas, which I think that's a nice statement, then does that mean that any idea can be art? And maybe that brings us back to this question about, A, is something art or not, and B, is it good or not? And I love that, what John just said, because it's really great. Never say anything that students can say themselves. It is so often that I will find in a group that I'll think about saying something, and if I wait, invariably one of the students says it. And it's so much more powerful, of course, when it comes from them. Okay, I'm going to move us on and switch gears completely again, because I want to give you a little flavor of various topics of philosophy. So I don't know how many of you who teach high school know about the High School Ethics Bowl, and I will just say a couple of things about that. You can look at our website, which will lead you to some resources about it, but it is a wonderful program that was started, about 7 years ago, in which high school students around the country engage in small teams in thinking about ethics questions. It's unlike debate in that they are not assigned sides, and they're really evaluated on the extent to which they contribute to a thoughtful philosophical conversation. Our center runs the Washington State High School Ethics Bowl, and there are now ethics bowls all over the country, and then there's a national bowl that all the winners of the various regional bowls come to at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in April. And it's really a wonderful event. And this next prompt comes from, it's actually one of the ones we used in our high school ethics bowl last year, and it's based on one that was written by the National High School Ethics Bowl some years ago. And it raises questions about ethics, how do I know the right thing to do, and then some larger social and political philosophical questions about fairness and justice. And would you mind reading this one, Andy?
Certainly. The SAT assesses the aptitude of high school students across the United States for the purpose of college admissions decisions. The SAT is considered an important part of a student's application package at most universities. The exam is broken down into 3 sections: math, critical reading, and writing. It takes approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes to complete. It costs $49. Potential scores range between 600 and 2,400. On the one hand, admissions officers contend that the SAT allows them to compare applicants on a standardized measure that is evaluated completely objectively, unlike grades and other admissions factors, and that the SAT offsets the grade inflation present at many high schools. Moreover, studies have shown a strong correlation between students' SAT scores and their first-year college GPA. Proponents also assert that preparing for the SAT provides students with valuable test-taking skills. On the other hand, critics question the fairness of this testing measure across all races, incomes, and cultures. Research has linked higher family income to high SAT scores across each of the 3 sections. The New York Times found that students whose family income of $20,000 or less have a mean score of 1310 on the SAT, while students whose family income is greater than 200,000 scores 1715 on average. Critics of the test cite the fact that many students take the exam multiple times. SAT scores increase by approximately 30 points each time the exam is retaken, but many families cannot afford to pay for their students to take the test multiple times. Moreover, wealthier families are able to engage tutors and to enroll their children in SAT prep courses, which can cost thousands of dollars. Some say the income wealth effect is even more widespread because wealthier families expose their children to a broader range of cultural ideas and experiences, thanks to travel and access to cultural events, all of which enhance performance on the test. Many argue that the goal of achieving a level playing field through the SAT exam is not realized in practice.
Okay, so the way in which I would approach this is first to ask students to try and think about all of the ethical questions raised by this case. So I'll start by asking you all to just think about what are some of the questions that you think are important in trying to think through this question about the SATs, which is obviously an ongoing debate in our society. What are the important questions here to ask?
There's a question from John. Why is education still so inequitable in general?
Right. Are the SAT, one was, are the SATs an effective measure of success in college? And then, why is education still so inequitable? Should the prep test be made available to all high schools? Why do we expect Okay, so given this truth that schools in more affluent areas don't face the same challenges and as inner cities, and parents are able to fund tutors and other outside private help, and like Judith says, the SAT is a good test if you know how to take the test. But if how to take the test is dependent on getting certain private help, does that mean then that the SAT is, as a result, always going to be inequitable? Or are there ways in which it could be equitable? I mean, I guess I'll start us with, what do you think? Is the SAT a good test? Should we be using the SATs? Many of you have students who are struggling with this, who are stressed out and taking this test or studying for it. Students have different learning styles, I suppose. Yeah, so the SAT is clearly aimed at a certain kind of knowledge and intelligence, and certainly there are all kinds of ways of learning that the SAT doesn't test. Yeah, so that's the question that Laura asks, is there a more fair method, right? I mean, are grades a fair method? I think that the part of the reason for the SAT is that people think grades aren't a fair method because of the different ways that grades operate in various schools. So, but how do we determine the student's ability to succeed in high school if there are some high schools that are way more difficult than others? So this is interesting. Vicki says that her daughter tutored math in a private tutoring center and was really upset by the knowledge that parents were paying almost $100 for a single-hour session. So could the SATs ban private tutoring? I mean, there's a whole industry, right, that's been built up around the SATs, and more affluent parents are the ones who are taking way more advantage of it, obviously. So I'm interested, Judith says some universities require an on-site writing test. Is the writing test before admission? I mean, it's part of what's considered in order to get in, or it's done after you're already accepted and starting? I know about the latter, but I didn't know about the former, if it exists. And would a writing test be necessarily more equitable, do you think, than the SAT? Would there be problems with the writing test potentially as well? I mean, someone said there's no way to completely level the playing field. Um, are there ways to do it that are better than the SAT? So what makes the test a fair test? If we're kind of, one of the questions someone asks is, is it a fair test? What makes it a fair test? What makes a test a fair test? How do we determine whether a test is fair?
And by the way, as you asked that question, Jana, it's obviously in the SAT context, there's a sort of a national scale there, but then teachers individually have to ask themselves that question in their own instructional design.
Absolutely, and both of the answers that have come out so far talk about objectivity, right? But isn't part of the idea of the SAT is that it was going to be objective, right? That it, unlike other kinds of assessments, it was going to be completely objective. So what both Patricia and John said are really similar, right? That basically the student has to have already some expectation of what the test is going to be based on what that student's been taught. So Phaedra says a fair test will allow for multiple demonstrations of knowledge and abilities. I really like that. So is it possible to create a national test like the SAT that allows for that, or does the SAT already allow for that, or does it not? What if people's backgrounds are all the same and they're supposed to have high grades from the SAT institution? So, okay, so you're saying that it's not just that people come from different backgrounds and are disadvantaged by poverty, et cetera. It's also even students who are all in the same background, students with different learning styles, et cetera. There's still going to be students who are disadvantaged by one test because everyone is coming from their own set of skills, experiences, etc.
And really, Patricia asks an interesting question. Is the test ultimately and truly trying to test knowledge or predict students' ability to succeed in college?
And is there a connection between those two things, do you think? Right? I mean, is it, and I'm asking the question, I don't know. I mean, is the ability to succeed in college, right, based on knowledge? Is it based on a certain set of skills? Is it, and also, I mean, college is not just an academic experience for most students. So success in college encompasses way more, right, than how you're going to do in your college classes. I think would have to be created by think tanks of K-12 teacher, college teachers, employers, et cetera, who know what success in college will require. So when you say I think it, you mean some kind of a test or assessment that could be created that would be a wider range kind of assessment than the SAT? Mm-hmm.
But you know, this has been raised a couple of times in a couple of different ways. One, by saying that the only students who can succeed are those who can afford the kind of tutorials and kind of support. But I haven't seen anybody yet suggest that maybe the solution is the SAT is fine, but you offer everyone the same level of support and tutoring.
Well, someone did in the early part of this conversation say, should the prep test be made available to all high schools? And yeah, I mean, should there be just as part of the high school curriculum, right? A prep course so that you couldn't get advantaged by taking all these private classes that that many students just can't afford and don't have the time to do after school. I mean, there's both the financial part of it and there's also just the time aspect to it. Many students have to work after school, et cetera. They're not going to be able to go sit in on an after school class. So that's the question. Does there need to be a standardized assessment at all? So to push at that a little bit, if there isn't, and what do we do, A, to determine who gets accepted to a certain college, and B, to set students up for success in that college, right? To make sure that they're getting into the place that's going to be the best fit for where they are in their academic journey. And I guess that raises a whole question really about the way in which college operates in our country, right? Because it's not just the standardized test and the different advantages that certain students have in taking them. It's also our whole college admissions experience and the way in which we stratify colleges by ranking them, and don't look at all colleges as good fits for certain kinds of students, and having a college degree as equally valuable, whether it comes from Harvard or from, you know, a much smaller, less known school in another part of the country. So is that kind of, can we even look at the SAT without looking at that bigger picture about college admissions and college snobbery in general? Yeah, so this is, many people have raised the whole gatekeeping question, that there is, you know, there are all kinds, some of this is all about industry, right? There's a whole business world built around college admissions and college admissions testing and college admissions testing prep, et cetera. So, and Patricia's point is a good one, that the very fact of wealth means some kids just have greater access to all kinds of cultural and intellectual experiences that other students don't have. How do we address that? What's the way to address that? So, okay, so if the test is designed to kind of see who really is going to be able to take on certain kinds of academic challenges, and others who will need to be in an environment where there is more remedial opportunities, et cetera. If that's the objective, and if the objective isn't to have everyone finish with the same score, is there a different way to approach it so that it isn't so stratified? Yeah, I'm a big fan of dual enrollment, and you know, part of the issue with dual enrollment is that's also expensive. At least in a lot of schools, in order to get the college credits, it's not inexpensive, and some students it's just beyond their reach. Now, there are other places where that's less of an issue, but in many places it's a serious issue. So I wonder what you all think. I don't know how many of you are high school students or high school teachers, but I wonder what you all think, given what you're saying about the AP, which is kind of related to this, because the other thing that's really being looked at for admission in many universities and colleges is how many AP classes do the students take, how do they do with them? That's a kind of a whole nother industry. So can I ask, let's see who said, Vicky, you said many colleges, yes, now participate in the Common App. Students bring to their responses their levels of understanding of questions presented. Might that process be enlarged in some way? Could you say a little bit more about that? Because do you mean on the Common App essays? I mean, what exactly are you thinking that might be helpful here? And yeah, I mean, some school districts just, especially more rural districts, AP options are just not available. And so how do those students then compete against students from, say, big suburban districts in which there are, hundreds of AP classes? And Jennifer, this is exactly what I was wondering about, because the whole college essay scene is a whole nother area, right, in which people are paying for coaches and in some cases even paying people to write their essays. How do you navigate through that and create an admission process that's really fair? Is it possible to create an admissions process that's completely, or at least very fair, or mostly fair?
And as Chris implies, and if you had a ring that would allow you to take the test.
This is a question that Maloney asked that's interesting. Is this different from taking exams and boards for, professional licenses? Is there a difference between something like the SAT and something like that? Yeah, the ring would be nice, wouldn't it? So Mary, when you say that students override the previous year's teacher's recommendation, you mean that someone has told them maybe you shouldn't take this AP course and they take it anyway because they think, no, I need to do this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jennifer's point is a nice one, because when you do boards for licenses, you're really being tested on what you need to know to practice whatever it is you're getting a license to practice, and it's not really about getting admission to the program itself and do you have the capability to do it. It's more like, have you learned everything you need to know, which does seem different than the SATs and certainly than the ACTs. Yeah, Patricia's this is a good question. I mean, when we think about fairness, then we're thinking about high school age students. Should we also be thinking about what is it students need to succeed? College isn't for everyone. Not everyone's going to go to college. Not everyone wants to go to college. What are some other ways to help students to find their ways without, any kind of stigma about not going to college, et cetera? So Melody says, I've had many average motivated students who earned a 4 or 5 on AP Psych or AP English Lit. How did they do that? They had to be somewhat motivated, didn't they, to work hard enough to get a 4 or 5? I mean, what in your view led to them being able to get that kind of score, given that they weren't particularly, in your view, motivated? Hmm.
He really offered a group of teachers a meaty question to answer. What's interesting as a parent of a high school senior right now, all these, this has very real ramifications on individual kids and their lives.
It sure does.
Jana, just a reminder, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay. I think this is our last thing of substance, so I'm going to take a couple more minutes and then I'll move into the resources.
Okay, great.
Well, and as you can imagine, given the interest in this question among the teachers, students have a lot to say about this question. And it can really be helpful for them to really think about this, because they're kind of often in it without having any space to step back and think about this system in which they're in which they find themselves, without really making necessarily a choice to be in, and thinking about the fairness of college admissions and the SAT test, and what might be ways of making this whole process more fair is really helpful. Well, exactly. I mean, Jennifer's point is exactly the point, right? Is there's the SAT and the whole college admissions and brand name school craziness has students enormously stressed out. I mean, I get students every year who come to the University of Washington and talk about how basically their senior year of high school was completely ruined by the whole college admissions process, which seems really unfortunate. And then that raises the question, which other people have raised, is, is it fair to anyone? Because, yeah, as Jennifer says, it's a cruel process.
And as you've said several times, it is a massive industry with lots of money flowing in all directions.
Yep. Yep. Well, that's the other thing. It's an interesting comment that Jennifer makes. What does a 17-year-old know about the rest of their lives? I've really noticed that in the last 10 to 20 years that young students are expected to know what they're going to do or what they want to do at very early ages in ways that was not true when I was in high school. I mean, I don't remember everyone asking me when I was 17, what are you going to major in, or what are you going to do after college? I mean, I had no idea. And I know my own boys, they just kind of make stuff up when people ask them that, because they didn't have an honest answer to that. The honest answer was, I have no idea. And I wonder about putting that kind of pressure on kids.
Well, it's destination education, meaning you know exactly
Right.
how this is going to take you to the next thing. And in some ways, what you're describing is a system at the high school level, at the secondary level, that is already getting kids pointing in the right direction. As Mary said, taking one class to jump ahead to make sure they're set up for something else. So it's destination of getting somewhere, as opposed to kind of figuring it out on the fly, the way many of us remember as kids.
Exactly, and feeling like Jennifer says, like they have to know what they want to study. I mean, isn't the whole point of going to college to learn about a lot of different things so you can decide what actually you want to study? Often that's not the case anymore. Students feel like they can't go unless they've already got it all figured out, which, as someone pointed out, at 17, is that really realistic?
And I do think,
Or healthy?
I think I'm right in saying that a lot of universities are also asking for majors earlier than they used to.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that's not the case at University of Washington, but it certainly might be the case in other places.
Yeah, I know of a few in the Triangle area around the Humanities Center, Duke, UNC, NC State. I know at least one of, or even two of those three do, whereas as a student myself, I remember not needing to declare until third year.
Right, right. Well, Jennifer, you're exactly right. I know that's true. I see it in my students. I have students who come into philosophy class and they say, well, I'm in engineering because my parents told me that's what I should do, and now I'm realizing that's not what I want to do, and it's really stressful for them because it has now become, you go to college to get a job, not to learn about the world, which is really, really a shame. And I don't think that one excludes the other, but it seems we tend to be so binary about these kinds of questions. Okay, well, we are probably close to out of time here, so I'm going to move us into just giving you some resources for further discussions and thinking with your students about these kinds of questions. So first of all, our website is full of lesson plans and information and resources and links for doing philosophy with young students. That we also have, as I said, we run the Washington State High School Ethics Bowl, so there's information about that. There's the cases. You're welcome to download the cases we use and use them in your classroom. The book that I published last year in 2016 is a nice textbook for doing philosophy with students. There's lots of lesson plans. All of the high school lesson plans were written by high school teachers who are doing philosophy in their classrooms. So that's that can be a really helpful resource as well. And then Plato, which is a national organization that brings together people who are doing philosophy in K through 12 classrooms around the country, also has what we call our philosophy toolkit online, which is full of lesson plans and other ideas for doing philosophy in the classroom, and we are continuing to add to that so that it can be as useful as possible for teachers. And I'll mention that one of the things Plato does is we have an essay contest for high school students that goes on every year. I think the essays are due in January, and if you look at the Plato website, you'll see information about that. We also have a journal, and we publish student work in philosophy, so both, you know, if you can see it online, both conversations that first graders and second graders have, as well as essays written by high school students, etc. So please check both of those websites out, and there are also links on both to other resources in philosophy on the internet. Well, I think, Jessica, you're really lucky because most parents these days aren't saying they just want their children to be happy and successful at any career. Well, I wouldn't say most parents, but many parents are unfortunately really pushing their students. And I think that we as professionals engaged with these students can really help them to start to think for themselves about what it is they want out of their own lives.
And Jana,
you're very welcome.
In some ways, that brings us back, Jana, to how we introduced tonight, which is giving our students the voice and the confidence in asking these questions. And in the last 15 minutes or so, as we've talked a lot about the sort of high school to college pipeline, it becomes pretty clear that asking those questions, being true and genuine to their interests and their identities, and really being able to push against this sort of salmon flow that they're on might be a really critical thing to give. But, you know, I also don't want to lose track of what you've also said numerous times, which is really encouraging that voice by allowing the questions to linger and to sit and to create a culture in the classroom where those questions are valued and affirmed. Jan, I cannot thank you enough for joining us. We really appreciate your insights. Jana, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure.
I also want to thank everybody who attended tonight's webinar. We have recorded this and it will be available to you along with the PowerPoint probably within about 24 to 48 hours. I would encourage you to pay attention to all the good work of the National Humanities Center at Plato at the University of Washington, where Jen is located. Social media is a great way to follow along and to make sure that you have access to all of the different activities and experiences we have to offer. I'm going to remind you that once tonight's seminar is completed, you will have a pop-up that allows you to take the evaluation and a certificate that will be emailed to you about an hour, but honestly I would give it until tomorrow morning. Just wake up and make sure that it's there. Please put the certificate in your own teaching portfolio and share it with your administration. The recordings that we have will be on our YouTube channel. If you go to the National Humanities Center website, you'll see links that go to that, both tonight's recording as well as all of our previous webinars. We would encourage you to take advantage of those. You can not only view them, but you can take sections of them and show them to your students or use them in a variety of professional ways. And finally, I'd like to encourage you to sign up for our webinars. Our next session is scheduled for October the 12th. We'll be working with former fellow Ellen McLarty from Duke University, and the topic for the night will be the art of revolution, Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria. That is, understanding these issues around the Arab Spring and the complexities of the Middle East, but doing it through art. I can tell you that that session is almost sold out, so if you're interested, please go and sign up. We would love to see you next week. Thank you again for joining us at the National Humanities Center. Have a great school day tomorrow. We'll see you next time. Good night.